Welcome to Inside Pharma Leadership. I'm your host, Keith Willis, and I am joined today by David White. Today's guest is a biopharma leader with 20 plus years turning scientific innovation into real world impact. From drug discovery to partnerships and platform build, he's helped early stage companies grow and deliver therapies that matter. Today, we'll break down what it takes to move from discovery to impact. David, welcome to the show.
Keith, pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I am too. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are with your current company.
Sure. So I'm a life scientist by training, PhD in molecular virology. Did an industrial postdoc, was not interested in chasing an academic career. I moved through the ladder of strategic responsibility and have landed now as Senior Vice President of Drug Discovery at a small company called ProteinQure, which is based in Toronto, although I am a remote employee based down in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
So you've built companies across big pharma, startups, and even venture. What's the common thread across all of those experiences?
Yeah, I would say that the common thread really has to do with keeping the mindset of value creation. Time is the currency of how you build a company, and keeping your eye on that prize has guided my career at every step. Really making sure that both my efforts and the efforts of the folks that I either operationally lead or my peer group or even my senior leadership is always mindful of the fact that we have limited capital and that capital needs to be wisely spent. And as a consequence, that gives you the guide rails by which you need to function. And if you fall off or outside of those guide rails, you ultimately, I've learned over the years, will fail. And that doesn't matter if you're in a big pharma department, you're doing a startup, you're in a smaller organization, nascent organization at different levels of funding, if you're public, if you're privately held, it doesn't matter. All those rules apply in each of those situations.
So given that, how do you make decisions about where you're going to focus your time given that capital is limited?
Yeah, that's a great question. One has to be able to understand the landscape. In my world, I think first and foremost about where is unmet medical need, and we build programs around what I just described, unmet medical need. We look at the competitive landscape. We look at time to clinic. We look at probability of success. And in all of those, by all of those means, we are able to make a decision as to whether or not the capital would be wisely spent in pursuing a particular opportunity. But the opportunity, again, what most resonates with me is if there is no unmet medical need, you're chasing something that's a dream that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I'd say that's one of the big differences now. Back in the day, it used to be there were a lot of companies that were pursuing the same thing. And when I look at, things like specialty products and, that type of stuff from a landscape perspective, that's a lot different. Everybody is looking for the unmet medical need.
That's exactly correct. The recent advent of the interest in rare diseases is a good example of working outside the box a bit. It's not me too drugs. It's really discovering novel biology. And amazingly enough, that novel biology in many cases will turn into fundamental insights that can lead to larger marketplaces for those particular drugs. Repositioning, repurposing drugs has become, something in vogue. So companies are willing to spend the dollars now on patient populations that appear small, but do have that unmet medical need, and they have translated themselves into large marketplaces.
Makes sense. I want to go back a little bit because one of the things that you said that struck me, you said you work remotely, and I think a lot of people think when you're looking at drug discovery that people are in labs and they're doing those type of things, and you're in the office, but only a couple of times, maybe a month. Walk us through or talk a little bit about that process and how it's very different now than it has been in the past. I'll make some assumptions that technology is involved in part of that process.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the base technology, the operational leadership of an organization that's doing basic research is really unchanged. I mean, we could talk about artificial intelligence and we could talk about other means by which we've accelerated discovery. But to get to your specific question, operational teams do exist. In fact, in my role, I lead an operational team of approximately 8 people in Toronto. They are lab faced or facing, and they are carrying out the experimentation that will produce the results that will forge a program ahead. And so that is unchanged. Now, for me, I find that I can be very effective on Zoom calls. I find that I can understand the pulse and the nuances of what's happening with our research on such Zoom calls. And with my frequent visits to the home office, as I call it, I get a very good feel for what is happening on the ground, where the research is going, and where we may have deficits that need to be addressed. So I don't think things have really changed all that much. In fact, if I was in Toronto full time, I would probably find myself in meetings 90% of the day and touching base in the lab environment, probably about that additional 10% of my time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I worked on a project, and what they found that at any given time, there were never more than maybe 40, 50% of people on campus or at their desk, that most of the times that they were in meetings. And I do think that is the challenge of corporate, is that we spend so much time in meetings that it's very difficult to get work done. So I'm sure there's some advantages of working from home on a regular basis.
Yeah, exactly.
So earlier when we spoke, you talked about the fact that you love this early part of the stage of development. What is that part that's so exciting for you, and why this part versus some of the later phases?
For me, I've always considered science and my training, my thought processes go to what I call the black box. And early discovery is all about the black box. And what I mean by that is science is still, although we have made great strides in the development of drugs and great strides in understanding human pathophysiology, it still remains a bit of a black box. When you think of the CNS, for example, central nervous system, what do we know about the brain? The 2000s were considered to be the decade or the decades of discovery of the central nervous system. And we're still, poking at that black box. And every day you find something unexpected, or you have to hypothesize what your next step is going to be in your experimental workflow. And that, to me is exciting. That's the early stage basic discovery that, again, is the heart of where, ideation translates into action. And once you have a program that you have established with an understanding of the fundamental principles of the pathophysiology that you're trying to address, you then get on sort of the classic train of drug development. So from screening of a particular target to the progression of that target to a development candidate, to safety pharmacology, to introduction into clinical trials, and on into commercialization, that's a very well-established route. But the heart and soul for me and the excitement for me in drug discovery is that early nascent ideation and translation into hypothesis building around that black box.
So talk a little bit about how you make that transition, I guess, from early drug development to the commercialization, especially since if you're not going to be involved in that commercialization. How do you tie those two pieces together to make sure that what you do earlier in some of the phase of clinical design ends up to have a drug that you can commercialize effectively?
You really have to define. Let me put it a different way. Coming into the start of a new program, we generally will define our target product profile. And a target product profile, or a TPP, has to do with this is the marketplace that we want to land in as we build this program. And we position our TPP to differentiate ourselves from the competition. We differentiate ourselves in ways that have to do with marketplace. We differentiate ourselves with patient populations. We differentiate ourselves again back to this concept of unmet medical need. I could give you examples if you'd like to hear more, but that's how we think about it. We take the long view that we really need, and it is a requirement to have an understanding that there is a niche that we will fill if we are able to produce a molecule that matches the TPP or target product profile that we have designed for the start of that program?
Yeah, an example would be great.
Okay, so an example would be for one of our current clinical candidates that we have in my organization. It's in the realm of oncology. And what we know about in the field of oncology with chemotherapeutic agents is that many patients will become resistant to that chemotherapeutic reagent over time. And as a consequence, one has to think, well, what is next in line with regard to the development of the next drug that can help that patient population once they become resistant? And so we have looked in this particular program at the majority of drugs that are being utilized in the disease of triple negative breast cancer. And they have a particular chemotherapeutic that's being used, and those patients become resistant over time, as mentioned. And what we decided to do was to build a molecule that would address that resistance factor. And so that's an add on, next in line drug that we hope will help patients who become resistant to that initial drug, that first or second line treatment. So we're looking a little bit downstream at the opportunity that we will have a patient population looking for a solution to the resistance that they have developed over time.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, do you foresee that at any point in time that would become a drug that would be used first instead of waiting till patients were resistant?
Yes, that would be our hope and dream, is to become first in line. There is a possibility of that occurring, but our current TPP is geared to what I described. But that will change. The landscape changes over time, right? There's a constant evolution of how docs are staging drugs and drug use. And if we produce a drug that's currently in clinical development, if we are ultimately able to introduce that into the marketplace, docs will figure out the best way to use it. And if it graduates to first in line, so be it. Wonderful for patients, wonderful for the organization. That's our goal. The mandate of anybody who works in pharma should be, how am I going to help a patient? How am I going to, meet that unmet medical need or address that unmet? And yeah, so that would be our hope and dream, but we certainly, can't predict that will occur.
Okay. Now, David, a little earlier you talked about repurposing drugs to have new drug discovery. Talk a little bit about that process and what that looks like.
Yeah. So what that has to do with, Keith, is really the fact that there's common physiology across the body. It's used in different ways to do different things. And it becomes a pathophysiological situation when something goes awry. And in the realm of, we had talked about rare diseases, that you can put energy, time, and effort into discovering a drug that impacts a pathway that is involved with that rare disease. But lo and behold, what you may find is that pathway that you have interceded in that rare disease also plays a role in a larger marketplace or in a different marketplace. And as a consequence, it's, I wouldn't say it's common, but it's becoming more common for folks to understand that this particular pathophysiology that I'll call a disease A, well, it has the same drivers in disease B. And as a consequence, you can translate the findings of your A direction into the B direction, if you can follow what I'm trying to describe there. That there is opportunity based upon, again, the premise, which is true, that human physiology is very redundant. And as a consequence, we can take advantage of that redundancy to find new homes for existing drugs or to find homes for drugs that make it into the marketplace and can be, again, repurposed for other disease indications.
Well, let me see if I can play that back because a couple of concepts you talked about a little earlier. So we know, for example, I'll just use allergy because it's allergy season. We know what the pathophysiology, we generally know the mechanism of action of what happens when somebody has allergies and you have a couple of different drugs at different parts in the process. You also know what molecules impact that. So in theory, you could look at a molecule because you wanted a different effect based on the pathophysiology and then begin to develop from that perspective, kind of starting with this base case, but adding an additional molecule, making some changes and edits, for lack of a better term, to get you to where you want to be. That's kind of how I see it in my in my mind.
Okay. Now, I'm not quite sure of the question that was buried in that line of thinking, but let me take a shot at it. So, thinking about allergy, we know the players, as you described, that are involved with the allergic response. Now, those are generally cytokines. They're called cytokines in the body, and those are molecules that regulate. Generally, they're considered to be part of the immune system, but they're hyperactive in cases of allergic reaction. Now, cytokines, as I mentioned, are part of the immune response, and the immune response also is hyperactive in many other disease indications. I could think of arthritis, I could think of psoriasis, I could think of other diseases. And so those players that are involved with allergic reaction that one wants to modulate to alleviate the symptoms of the allergic reaction can be repositioned in order to build an asset base to attack psoriasis or to attack arthritis or other disease indications.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. That explains why you have some drugs in certain categories that play across so many different disease states for that reason. Because in essence, what you're doing is repurposing some of those elements for those drugs.
Yeah, and I'll add one additional point, which I think is important, because I actually helped build a company that was involved with repurposing. In large pharmaceutical companies, there are withering assets sitting on the shelf. So drugs that were developed, they were safe in the clinic, but for various reasons, the programs were shut down. And they were shut down because of the fact that, there was a changing marketplace. There was a reorganization. There was this or there was that. Now, we have taken advantage of that in previous life that I had by grabbing those withering assets and understanding their impact on physiology and pathophysiology. And although the original indication drive for that drug was, again, I'll call it A, uh, we now understand that, well, it's applicable to B. And I could give you, a great example. I'm sure you're aware of it. Is the story of Viagra. Do I need to go through that, or are you aware of the history of
I'm
Viagra?
aware of it. I don't know if the
Yeah.
audience is. If you could do a high level overview of that, that would be great.
Sure. I'm sorry if I interrupted. Very quickly, Viagra was developed it's an inhibitor of a particular enzyme that's involved with cardiovascular control of a hypotensive response. And it was found in early preclinical studies and then in the clinic that there was actually the known side effect of what Viagra is now prescribed for. And so that was a repurpose. It was developed as a cardiovascular treatment drug, and it turned into a blockbuster for use in, erectile dysfunction.
Oh, that's a really good example. Maybe talk a little bit about the business aspects. So I think a lot of times when we think about drug development, we only think of the lab piece, the how that's the operations piece, all those pieces come together. A lot of what you've talked about is on the business end and how drug discovery is very key in developing a commercial asset. Can you talk a little bit about that? And how do you develop that muscle as a scientist? So clearly there's a scientific bend that you think about when you're doing drug discovery, but there's another element to think of it from a pure business standpoint of is what we're developing going to be an asset that we can commercialize. So it's two
Okay.
pieces of that. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it's clear.
Okay.
How, one wears that hat of thinking about, strategic initiatives that can lead to a drug really have a lot to do, again, with some of the concepts that I've previously described. That, one has to factor in unmet medical need. Once again, I'll use that term. It's super important. But then one also has to look, here is our capital base, here is our time frame, here is the competitive landscape. Here is the time to push through clinic a particular drug opportunity. And that may not always align with what assets one has in order to invest in moving that drug forward. So strategically, you have to think about that. And I can give you an example. If you think about a drug for treating cardiovascular disease, or you think about a drug for a central nervous system disorder, you have to sort of look at the clinical trial length, the number of patients to be enrolled. A cardiovascular drug takes thousands of patients and many, many years to push through the clinic. And there's a huge competitive landscape out there. And, there's also, as I've described with the thousands of patients, there's a price tag associated with that. And so you have to factor that in the business case as to whether or not this is going to make sense. For a smaller company, which doesn't have that 12-year window to push a cardiovascular drug through the clinic, it's a no-go. But for a large pharma, they have the appetite for such opportunities and they will take them on. Now, our job as smaller companies is to find the niche opportunity that a large pharma will want to partner on. And that's really the path that we think about strategically from a business development perspective.
Okay. Now, the business development perspective, is that more active on your end, or is that more active on the large pharma end, or is it kind of a combination of both?
It's really a combination of both. You have big pharma out there scouting for ideas and opportunities, and you also have the smaller companies producing what I'll call the novelty, the insights, the genesis of potential new medications that big pharma is not willing to invest in the basic research to support. And so you have this balance between what a small organization can do as a nimble versus what a big pharma can do with its machine of moving molecules through the path of clinical development onto commercialization. So it's a very nice balance. Big pharma does not really want to invest deeply in basic research. Smaller companies can, generally invest in basic research because they roll out of academic labs. And as a consequence, it is basic research. But, smaller companies do not have the resources to push things downstream aggressively, such as a big pharma.
Okay. Now, what's been your experience around raising capital? I know that talking with some CEOs of startups and I don't know that it changed over the last 5 years. I always hear this piece around raising capital. Have you found that to be a challenge with where your company is at this stage?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I can answer that in a few different ways. Capital availability will wax and wane. There are different sort of, times when going out to the street to look for dollars, it can be quite fruitful. And other times, it can be very dry. We as a small company obviously are constantly looking at the raise of capital. And that capital is a requirement to keep the business growing, to keep the organization moving forward, to hit the inflection points that we define as important for our drug discovery efforts. Now, what I would say is that I think every smaller company out there struggles with the raise of capital. And in today's marketplace, for example, things are a bit dry. Companies who invest, the VC houses, the private houses, and so forth, are looking for assets. And assets are things that grow from basic research. Companies who have a platform that will produce assets but need the cash to feed the platform to make the assets are not really receiving the dollars that are required to create novelty in the drug discovery space. So there's that push and pull that's constantly there that I've experienced from both sides of the table. As we had discussed before in one of our meetings, I've worked in venture capital and I've sat on both sides of the table. I've been looking for dollars to keep a company going or starting a company. And I've also been making decisions as to whether or not this is a wise investment for the venture capital house in an idea that's been brought forward to the organization as an investable opportunity.
Okay. If you put your venture capitalist hat on, what would be advice that you would give to somebody in a startup that's trying to raise capital?
The best advice I would give is the quality of your organization is based upon the quality of your people. And so you need to have put together a stellar scientific advisory board. You need to have the blessing of thought leaders in the field that your particular idea has merit, has value, and is translatable into a product that can help people. And in the absence of that, I think any company will struggle. Wonderful ideas can emerge from anybody and any place, but venture capital dollars generally are chased by organizations that have what I described. The ability to receive funding for an entity where, somebody has an idea, brings it forth, the venture capital house will do their diligence, and if they find that there's no support by the thought leaders in a field or the key opinion leaders, they generally are not going to invest in that company. So I think the underpinnings of getting an investment really have to do with the cachet that one can bring to the table in order to push ideas forward.
Those are really good points. And it's interesting because when I think of cachet, I think more of charisma versus, I'm sure you have people that kind of fit on both sides of the table. You have some people from a scientific skill set and knowing what they're doing are very good, but don't necessarily have the ability to be able to tell that medical story about that unmet need. And then you may have people on the other side have the ability to tell the story about the unmet need, but scientifically maybe not as strong.
Yep, that's exactly correct. I would describe it in those terms that you do need to have, that blessing that I described in the SAB that encompasses a broad collection of skills, and those skills do reach into, okay, the patient population out there in the world is such that, there is again the unmet medical need, and there is a path through the clinic that will get blessed by the FDA to get this drug to those individuals that need it. But at the start, the ideation level, you have to have those individuals who really understand this is a mechanistic proposal. This is a pathophysiological, uh, in, you know, um, a pathophysiological event that is occurring in patient populations that we have dissected, and we understand the underpinnings. And if one could develop a means to intervene in that process, we believe that there would be a path to a drug that will help people, which translates to success for an organization that is making that drug.
Makes perfect sense. What would you say is the biggest challenge that you have right now in general within your organization as you try to move things forward?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge comes back to capital. It always is, at the back of our minds. But I always think of time. And time, I mentioned previously, is, it's the currency of what I call, smaller biopharmaceuticals or biotech, right? Your time is limited you need to hit your defined inflection points in order to grow your organization. And if you can't achieve that, your investors are going to be very keen on seeing your ability to advance your program. And if you are unable to advance that program at a pace that you have promised, they're going to start to grow skeptical of what you're trying to achieve. So you may have heard the word tranching. And so these days, a lot of investments are tranched. So they are built around inflection points for an organization. So moving a company forward, you'll have a venture capital house bless the idea and put on the table a certain amount of dollars. But they'll say you can have a fraction until you hit this milestone. Then you can have another fraction when you hit the next milestone. So they've used sort of a proverbial term. They tighten the thumb screws a little bit on us in order to make us successful, because we're not going to be successful if we don't have that capital. And we have to use that capital wisely and timely. This cannot drag on. But the limited partners of a venture capital house are looking for a return on investment. And, their investments cannot be such that they extend. They have to have very defined points of decision making that something should move forward or something should stop.
So, is there anything else, David, that I should have asked that I haven't asked you?
No, I think you've been quite comprehensive, Keith. If we're at a point of close, I would say that for drug discovery, it's still a fascinating world in which to work. There are so many unknowns, so many diseases for which we do not have adequate treatments or therapies. And I foresee that, as we continue to gain knowledge, that those opportunities will translate into successful drugs that will get to the folks who need them. And that was the draw for me to get involved in this business. And I think it's a draw for many smart people. I like to joke, and maybe, it's not really a joke, but I say to myself, a lot of people could sell insurance and they could be very successful. But I can work in biopharmaceutical drug discovery, and I can actually hopefully develop drugs that are going to help people. So there's an altruistic nature to what I do, and I take some pride in that. And so what I would say in closing is, smart people think about getting involved with drug discovery, because at the end of the day, you can really help a patient population who needs it. If one wants to define, what one would want for, let's say, a loved one, you want health, you want contentment. And I think those are the two real things that resonate with people. If you don't have health, you underappreciate, I think we all underappreciate, the impact that impaired health has on our life and our lifestyle and our ability to lead a productive life. And we, in the pharmaceutical industry recognize that and are trying to address that as aggressively as we can.
Well, David, thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation and appreciate you joining Inside Pharma Leadership.
Great, Keith. It's been a pleasure. Glad to speak with you. And hopefully this will resonate with folks who have the chance to view it in the future.
I think it will. Thank you.